All right, hello everybody. In this short series of video lectures, I'm going to be talking about kind of returning to basics, so intros, body paragraphs, conclusions, all the basic component parts of an essay. And that's just because I think that sometimes it's a long time between when we are initially beginning to think about what makes a good introduction paragraph and when we get to a college composition course. So it's good to sort of remind ourselves of what those components are. So the first thing is to kind of think for a moment about what we think or believe or have been told should be in a good introduction. So things that usually come up are things like a hook, which of course is kind of one of my pet peeves, mostly because I believe the topic is interesting. We won't need some sort of clickbait first sentence. So introductions in general should introduce the topic. Obviously, we want to be able to tell our reader what we're going to be writing about. Provide context and background information, establish the author's perspective, so generally that's you as a speaker, what is your perspective, provide the reader with an idea of what to expect in the essay. Sometimes we talk about it as the reader-writer contract. I'm going to start the introduction, I'm going to make sure that my reader knows what I'm going to be talking about. So again, something that's maybe less necessary, more situational is defining necessary terms. So, again, if there's some sort of technical term or jargon that you need to use in your introduction or that you need to make sure your reader knows, then you would include it in your intro. Now, John Trimble, who wrote the book Writing with Style, he's an instructor in Texas, has this sort of two different approaches that he classifies introductions into: the backdoor approach and the front door approach. And really the difference is about directness and efficiency. And again, that's one of the things I really advocate in writing is clarity and efficiency. So the difference between those two, the backdoor approach, which is kind of what you don't want to do, something that I've for a long time called a throat clearing opener, where you're just kind of getting ideas out there. Number one, has no point of view, so there's no clear point of view for a reader to hold on to. The author doesn't seem to have a whole lot to say, and they're not really valuing the reader's time, and there's a sort of a lack of audience awareness. So again, the easiest thing for a reader to do is to stop reading. So we don't want to give the reader any sort of excuse to stop reading. Now, what Trimble says is better is what he calls the front door approach, which is the author is not only sure of their goal, but that goal is clear to the reader, and that we're valuing the reader's time, and that we're writing for an informed reader, which is a good audience. Now, both of these indicate valuing the reader's time. So basically what we mean there is we want to give our reader some information that is important, that is helpful, that is new to them. So we want to make sure that, hey, when we're having this opportunity to speak through the page, we want to make sure that it's worth somebody else's time to read. So Trimble gives these examples from some of his students in the upper division classes. So the backdoor approach: Shakespeare's Hamlet, admired for its poetic style and intriguing characters, has remained a classic for over 3 centuries. The character of Hamlet is probably one of Shakespeare's most perplexing and most pleasing. He is easily identified with because of his multifaceted personality and realistic problems. So again, there's not a whole lot being said here other than Shakespeare is famous and the character of Hamlet is pretty interesting. And there are some other sort of problems here. I wouldn't call Hamlet's problems necessarily realistic, because his uncle has killed his father and married his mother, and he's haunted by his father's ghost. So, you decide whether or not that's a realistic problem. But, again, what I would see here is there's not a whole lot being said. Now, if we compare that to a more direct front door approach, we get this. He killed his brother, he married his brother's wife, he stole his brother's crown. A cold-hearted murderer, he is best described by his brother's ghost as, quote, that incestuous, that adulterate beast. The bare facts appear to stamp him as an utter moral outlaw. Nonetheless, as his soliloquies and anguish asides revealed, no person in Hamlet demonstrates so mixed a true nature as Claudius, the newly made king of Denmark. That's interesting. It's definitely packed with more information. It definitely has a clear goal, which is to focus not on Hamlet, but on Claudius, a different character in the play. And that the argument here is that he has a mixed true nature, different from anybody else in the play, which is arguable. So Trimble goes on to say that a good opener gives you momentum, confidence, and the extra incentive to make the remaining paragraphs worthy of the first. Again, it's that first impression type of idea that if you can open strong, then not only do you have that foundation, but you also are kind of trying to keep yourself on par with where you started. So if we think about this for a second, we think about what are the most common mistakes students write or make in writing intro paragraphs. And you could pause and think about this for a minute if you want. But I'll just go ahead and give you the 5 that I see the most often. So number 1 is too much context, right? The writer or the student's trying to pack in too much information, telling us absolutely everything, and there may be things that are unnecessary. So for example, if you're writing about artificial intelligence and whether or not it will harm the economy, it may not be necessary to talk about the entire history of computing and artificial intelligence in your intro paragraph. Just focus on the economy. Lack of context. So this often happens when a writer assumes that the writer has a solid background already. So it's a kind of a tricky game to play. We want to make sure that we're thinking about our audience, right? Audience awareness. Who is our audience? A general informed audience has a good idea of what artificial intelligence is, but they may not know what machine learning is or something like that. So again, we want to make sure that we're providing the context necessary. So again, a fine line. Think about what is pertinent to your argument, and you can always explain later. Unclear terms, so technical terms are not clearly defined. And then the last 2 are about thesis. So a vague or unclear thesis, right? So it doesn't specifically address a central argument, or it's not clear what the writer means, or that there is no thesis, which also happens sometimes, or that thesis is a question, right? Again, it's a thesis statement, so it's not a thesis question. We have a research question that generally leads us to a thesis statement, but that thesis statement should be a claim that appears in MLA format at the end of the very first paragraph, so the end of the intro paragraph. So hopefully that makes sense. So things that I always think about when I'm writing an intro that reflect those errors or help us avoid those. Number 1, what does my reader likely already know? They probably know what AI is. They probably have Siri on their phone. What do I want to make sure they know? And again, focusing on this idea of artificial intelligence, I want to make sure that they know there are different types of artificial intelligence. It's not all one, and that there are limitations maybe. And what are they probably not familiar with? Again, in this case, it might be some of that jargon, things like artificial general intelligence or artificial superintelligence or something like that, that I want to make sure that they know, because I can't just assume that they know all of that information. And then again, are there any specific terms that I need to define? If I want to talk about machine intelligence or deep learning or something like that with AI, I want to make sure that I provide my reader with at least a very short explanation, even if I'm going to expand on that later. So again, much like Trimble, I sort of thought about this a lot and thought about the different ways that students often approach intros. And I sort of compared them to characters from a movie called The Princess Bride. So if you haven't seen the movie, it'll still make sense. But if you have seen the movie, it'll just be a little bit funnier, hopefully. No guarantees. So the first one I would say is what I call the giant. And this is a student who's sort of specializing on brute force of facts. There's no real consideration of importance, and they're not really interpreting things very much. They're just kind of hoping that the sheer strength of fact will win the day, right? So this is Fessick. Fessick's intro would look something like this. There are a lot of books on the apocalypse. People like reading them because they're entertaining. Some of these books are bestsellers. The Road by Cormac McCarthy was published in 2006. It is about the apocalypse and was a bestseller. They turned it into a movie. Because these books and movies are popular, people clearly like reading about the apocalypse. All of that is fact, but there's very little interpretation there. It's not saying a whole lot, and the thesis here is a little bit circular. Now, I did write these, but I would definitely say that I've seen students do a lot of intros like this. So one is that, no interpretation, just a lot of facts at the outset. Now, the next one I would say, which is surprisingly common, is what I would call the wit. And this is a person who thinks a lot, but they kind of think that they're smarter than the reader, and they try and use big words and maybe don't understand or maybe not have the correct word. More importantly, they have no specific plan. We can change big words to more manageable words, but if there's no plan there, there's no sort of clear goal, then we have a bigger problem. And sometimes this is done, the use of big words is done to mask having no plan, right? It's kind of the art of saying nothing. So let's look at the Wit's intro, Vincini's intro. Few people can truly comprehend the severe complexity of apocalyptic literature because there is a cornucopia of material that one must truly master in order to sufficiently understand the nuances. Only a great fool would overgeneralize the purpose of such stories and in the interpretation of the societal values in place in such literature. Clearly, there is value to reading such stories. These stories are not only intriguing, although most average citizens would view them as such, but they also presage the coming time when people will have to fend for themselves in a threatening and inhospitable culture. Okay, you probably zoned out there at some point, right? What is actually being said? It's a lot of hard work to sort of parse out. This is only 2 sentences. Again, we're not really taking the reader's time into account. We're not really being aware of our audience. Now, there is an interesting thesis here, but it could be reworded. So, again, it's your friendly reminder that, honestly, I would rather you use the language that you are comfortable with and not worry about trying to find that $5 or $10 word that's going to make you sound fancy. Better to just use a vocabulary you're comfortable with that is still suitable for a professional environment. Okay, the next one is the Swordsman. This is another person who does study carefully, but they kind of fall into repetition. They know their stuff, but again, they're repeating it over and over again, and they might use some statements of personal preference. So here's Inigo's introduction. I've read a great many books on the topic of the apocalypse. I've learned a lot from these books, and what they have taught me is that we find society to be important. We'll learn a lot about the apocalypse in this paper. This paper will provide a great number of details. Prepare to read. Now, again, I've seen this quite often, that students know their material, they're confident in their material, they want to share that material, but there's nothing really compelling here at the beginning. We don't know what the overall goal of the paper is going to be, other than, hey, I've read a lot, I want to share this knowledge with you. But what knowledge is it? What have you learned from all of this reading and other studying that you've done on this? If we can narrow it down, that would help. And again, by the way, before we go on to the last one, I will say that all of these are intros that I've, again, seen students use and things that we can work with. They're not terrible if they're at a beginning stage where we're just starting to get our feet under us. So the last one is the one that we want to emulate, obviously. This is the Dread Pirate Wesley, or the Dread Pirate Roberts, aka Wesley. He has a clear goal. They have very few faults. They know their stuff. They've worked hard to master it. They have a plan, but more importantly, they are willing to adjust that plan as things come up. So what I mean by that is you might have a plan for your paper when you're writing your introduction, but as the paper unfolds, the paper might go in a different direction. It is far easier to change your thesis to match your paper than to change the paper to match the thesis, right? So, be willing to adjust things as they come up. So here's Wesley's. Thinking about the end of the world is nothing new. Various interpretations of the apocalypse can be found in all major religions, ranging from Christianity to Hinduism. However, over the past century, particularly in Western culture, there has been a rise in the number of films and books about a potential apocalypse. While the nature of the apocalypse varies by story, these stories all appear to investigate the meaning of the individual in society. Fictional stories of the apocalypse allow readers and audience members to consider societal values and morals, while also taking into account the fragility of modern society. So, same topic, same essential information. Again, we're going from broad to narrow, and we have a nice clear thesis statement there. So this is kind of more what we want to be doing. So the question is, how can you be like Wesley? How can you write this type of introduction? Well, number one, you got to know your material. Research, 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 or if you're doing a literary analysis or something like that, read, do your close reading, do your annotations. Have a plan, right? You know how you want to present your information. Be willing to modify that plan as you come to new realizations, find new information, or what have you. Keep your end goal in mind. What are you setting out to prove? And that might be thinking about, well, what was my research question? How did I actually get into this? What was my access point? And then, of course, for those of you that have seen the movie, it's always helpful to have a tolerance to iocane powder. If you haven't seen the movie, go see it, and then you'll get that reference. I'm not going to give it away. So just a last little bit here to wrap out this video. If you want a visual, because I know some of us are visual learners, so one way to think about an intro is as this sort of inverted pyramid where we have our opening sentences that kind of start really broad, introduce the idea, and then get straight into things. Again, I would suggest avoiding quotes or rhetorical questions in your intro. You can save that for the body paragraphs. The middle paragraphs build more context, right? Really building towards that final sentence, which is going to be your thesis. And then the sort of the pointy bottom of that pyramid or upside down triangle is your thesis. And that is your solid claim that is clear, arguable, and specific. Okay, there you go. If you have questions, comments, concerns, jokes, memes, or recipes, please let me know. Otherwise, I'll talk to you all later.